So thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. Thank you all so much for coming out on a school night, no less. I really appreciate it. Let's see, I wonder, hopefully we can get the projector. All right, awesome. So today I wanted to talk to you about science, technology, culture, and education. I'm going to use this acronym STEM a lot today. For those of you who are not familiar with this term, STEM stands for science, technology, engineering, and math. And this is a pretty common, popular acronym, particularly in the universe of education. So over the last 15 to 20 years, there's been kind of increasing emphasis put on STEM fields in the context of education. So in case you haven't noticed this, like kids, young people in school are encouraged to kind of really engage with STEM subjects in school. They're encouraged to major in STEM fields in college, and they're encouraged to kind of choose STEM careers. This is an effort that has had kind of widespread financial resources behind it, widespread kind of buy-in from both government and industry. And this really forms the backdrop of my talk. So this educational emphasis on encouraging people to choose STEM. I also wanted to say that, as Michael mentioned, my background is in computer science. So I have a degree in computer science. So my perspective on this kind of puts the emphasis on the T in STEM. So I'm a technology developer, a computer science person, and so that's my particular perspective on this topic. I wanted to start by talking about just the lack of diversity in STEM fields. So as a woman in computer science for the course of my career, this is something that I've had to grapple with in a really personal way. Of course, I'm not the only person having these experiences. Women are just underrepresented in computing fields and also particularly underrepresented in engineering fields. By and large, the story is more positive for STEM fields as a whole. You can see that in this chart here. This is research done by the American Association of University Women. And you can see that we're getting to about 50-50 in STEM majors as a whole, women and men. That's given a big boost by fields like biology and psychology, where women are overrepresented. But yeah, for my home disciplines, things are still kind of out of balance. For computing and engineering fields in particular, also there's a similar kind of imbalance when it comes to the representation of underrepresented minorities. So this is data from that same study looking at ethnicity, looking at those kinds of demographics. What's shown here are the breakdown according to both gender and ethnicity. What you see in the upper left-hand corner is the percentages of people in the population at large. I've highlighted in pink for you kind of minority men in dark blue and minority women in orange. So that is their representation in the population at large. They're somewhat underrepresented in the university population, the students who are earning bachelor's degrees, but they're quite kind of strikingly even more underrepresented in the people who are earning degrees in engineering and computer science. These patterns of representation kind of follow people into the workforce. So in the engineering and computing workforce, these are domains that are also quite undiverse, predominantly really dominated by white and Asian men. So this is a broad snapshot of kind of the national workforce. We can also look at particular companies. So there's been some pressure about the lack of diversity in Silicon Valley, and one of the things that that's resulted in has been firms like Google kind of publishing diversity reports. And so this is current information about what the workforce at Google looks like, in particular what their technical workforce looks like. So these are the people that are actually kind of building the Google system. So about 20% women, that really tracks with the percentage of women who are earning bachelor's degrees in computer science. And man, almost like no underrepresented minorities in a lot of these tech firms. Can contrast that with the more kind of dominant ethnicities. So these are patterns in our educational system that kind of follow us into the workforce. It's interesting to look kind of way back into childhood, and you can find those patterns really starting to appear there. So this is one example that kind of documents some of these patterns really way back into kids' early experiences. So this is a study where the researchers looked at the kinds of toys that people buy for girls and the kinds of toys that people buy for boys. So they looked at data from Amazon, and in particular, they're interested in like STEM-related toys, so science and engineering-related toys. And they found that STEM-related toys are about 7 times more likely to be purchased for a boy than a girl. So these trends have pretty deep roots in our society. So I look at data like this, and I also experience, what it's like to be a minority in a STEM field. And I have a couple responses. I mean, first of all, I don't think this is good. Personally, for me, being a minority in the field of computer science has brought up some challenges for me over the course of my career, and I'd love to have it be easier for women to have vibrant, successful careers in computing, and not encounter some of the challenges that I encountered. So just on a very personal level, I'd like to see these dynamics change. But I also think it's really important for our society, that's an increasingly technologically mediated society, that the people who are building those technologies are representative of our society at large. That there's something unsettling and problematic about our society being built on systems that are kind of constructed by a pretty limited slice of our population. That doesn't seem to be like a great foundation. The other reason I'm kind of frustrated and exasperated by statistics like these is that I think it really, really, really doesn't have to be this way. So when I look around the world and I think about and look at the kinds of things that different people are doing and different people are building and making and thinking about, what I notice is that STEM is everywhere. STEM is just something that people in every culture, in every subculture, kind of in every community are doing all the time. And the problem is not so much that lots of people aren't engaging in STEM. The problem seems to me that our dominant culture is really bad at recognizing and seeing and honoring STEM in all the places that it's happening in society. So I wanted to share with you some of the places where I think STEM is alive and well, and yet we seem to be oblivious to it. So I grew up in New Mexico, in northern New Mexico, and lowrider culture was a big part of my childhood, especially kind of middle school and high school, right? There was a fantastic and fascinating subculture of mostly dudes who did this, like on their free time, right? Spent a lot of time taking apart, rebuilding, reimagining cars. So these guys were not guys who were finishing high school and then going on to like MIT and Caltech, right? By and large, that wasn't really the trajectory for them. And yet, in retrospect, why not, right? So think about this as a practice, like incredibly rich with STEM. So think about the brilliant kind of mechanical engineering and electrical engineering that goes into kind of taking apart an existing vehicle, kind of completely reimagining it, kind of hacking it, adding a bunch of stuff that wasn't there at first, and kind of putting it all back together and having it function kind of both in the original way and in entirely new, strange and delightful ways. All sorts of vibrant, rich engineering, STEM expertise here. Just expertise that we haven't talked about in that way, that we haven't honored in that way, that we haven't privileged in that way. Here's another example. This is another kind of personal example. So I'm a long-time textile crafter. And lots of people might look at this picture and be like, those are like crochet doilies. Like, what the heck does that have to do with STEM, right? But I want to encourage you to think about textile crafts like crochet and knitting as profoundly mathematical activities. So you can think of this as the activity, kind of the mathematical activity that takes a one-dimensional thing, a string, right, and turns it into a two- or a three-dimensional thing. So that starts to hint at the mathematical richness that's present in these spaces, right? I want you to also think about the geometrical understanding and the algorithmic understanding that it takes to like crochet a ring of that doily and have there be exactly like 13 white dots. So there are 13 white dots around a circle there. They're not like 11 and a half or 10 and a quarter, right? It takes some serious mathematical calculations, mathematical understanding to make that happen. Think also of the expertise that it takes to plan this out so that you get a flat thing and not a hat, right? Or you get a hat, you don't get a hat and you don't get like a ruffle, right? That's another possibility. So much kind of mathematical expertise, mathematical knowledge, algorithmic knowledge that's involved in this kind of work, in these kinds of activities. And yet, again, we're largely blind to it. So you don't see like big foundations saying, man, like every middle school should have a crochet club, and that's how we're really going to get everybody to understand geometry. Like that seems kind of preposterous and silly, right? But maybe we should be doing that. So another example, this pictures of DJ Grandmaster Flash. So he is one of the grandfathers or fathers perhaps of hip hop. He's one of the first people in the 1970s to take apart, kind of re-engineer and repurpose turntables to really invent this entirely new musical form and really to invent this entirely new kind of form of cultural expression. So he is rightly honored as a groundbreaking cultural figure, as a groundbreaking musician. But I want to propose that he should also be honored as a groundbreaking engineer. Again, the expertise, the creativity, the sense of kind of innovation and play that it takes to take apart, kind of hack and repurpose a traditional piece of electronics equipment, that it took to do that work, and then from that work to invent kind of an entirely new cultural form. Again, kind of brilliant engineering expertise kind of coupled with brilliant kind of musical and cultural intuition. I wanted to conclude with another example that's close to home. I had the tremendous privilege of touring the SAR collection earlier today, and man, that was awesome. But anyway, this artifacts like these are well represented in that collection. This is a beautiful seed pot by Dorothy Trevino from Acoma Pueblo. Again, I think we can think of this as an object that is so rich with STEM, so deeply connected to it. So first, I want you to think about this as a spectacular feat of engineering. So this was made out of dirt. So think about like the engineering expertise that is required to go from like dirt to that, right? Like that's amazing engineering. I want to also talk about the mathematical and kind of algorithmic knowledge that is embodied here. Think about the mathematical expertise it takes to plan out this complex, repeated geometric pattern, and how once again this like perfectly kind of covers the entire circumference of this complex curved surface. There aren't like 15 and a half patterns. Like it perfectly fits that surface. For those of you who are like maybe math nerds out there, think about non-Euclidean geometry, this kind of complex mathematical topic that deals with geometry on non-flat surfaces. Kind of beautifully embodied here. So STEM is alive and well in like every culture. And it's beautifully, vibrantly represented in every culture. And I think what we need to do is start to open our eyes and acknowledge and celebrate and invest in all of these different ways that STEM is explored and expressed and embodied. So STEM is just everywhere. We need to see it and recognize it and name it and celebrate it. I wanted to shift gears a bit now and talk to you about a different way in which STEM is everywhere, and STEM is deeply connected to our culture. In particular, I wanted to talk to you a bit about how technology these days seems to be everywhere and seems to be really impacting our culture and our society in all sorts of interesting, fascinating, and perhaps troubling ways. So as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, we're living in an increasingly technologically kind of mediated world. We are, in particular, big parts of our society are being kind of controlled by or guided by computational or algorithmic systems. Of course, perhaps most visibly to us, a big part of our social life these days is computationally mediated. through sites like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and so on. So I imagine probably most of you in this room perhaps went on this website today, right? This is a common experience. I think we are also just starting to realize the impact that these new computational tools are having on our culture, on our communities, on our politics. So these systems are built around our attention, right? It always behooves us to kind of go back and remember some stuff about them. So these are for-profit companies that make their money through advertisement, right? And they want our attention, they want our eyeballs, they want our engagement. And it turns out that a really, really effective way to get us to pay attention, a really, really effective way to get us really engaged, kind of passionately engaged, is to make us mad and to make us afraid. That's kind of what the algorithms that run these systems have found out in the last 10 years or so. That anger and fear, awesome for engagement. Turns out maybe not so awesome for other stuff. So in particular, maybe not so awesome for our political landscape or our social landscape, right? And we're starting to see the repercussions of that emphasis on things like anger and fear. This is a project that I think beautifully highlights some of the unsettling qualities of social media. This is a little bit old now, but I still think super relevant. This is a project that the Wall Street Journal did a couple of years ago. And what it does, and it's still live, you can still go to this page and see current data. But what it does is it gives you a snapshot side by side of kind of liberal Facebook and conservative Facebook. And what it makes very apparent is that these are these two quite isolated bubbles that people live in, and that people are having completely different conversations in the two bubbles, and that there's very little overlap. What you also see, if you kind of follow this over time, is that those bubbles are getting more and more angry and more afraid and more extreme, right? So this is what social media is encouraging and helping along in our political sphere. There are all sorts of less visible ways in which algorithmic kind of computational systems are impacting our culture, impacting our society. So most likely these days, if you go to get a mortgage or if you go to get a job, you might interface with an algorithmic system that'll take some data about you and then either make those decisions outright or play a large role in making those kinds of decisions, whether or not you get a mortgage, if you do get a mortgage, what your interest rate is, whether or not you qualify for a life insurance policy, whether or not you get parole if you happen to be a prisoner. So this was an amazing study done by the wonderful journalist, nonprofit ProPublica a couple of years ago. So it turns out there's algorithmically run software that's being used in jurisdictions around the country that helps judges determine whether or not defendants should get out on parole. And this software, you feed it a bunch of information, like where the defendant lives, kind of their ethnicity, who their known associates are, kind of what the crime they committed is, and so on. And it'll spit out a number that predicts whether or not they're likely to go on to commit another crime. Well, it turns out that this software was overestimating the likelihood that Black people would go on to commit new crimes and underestimating the likelihood that white people would go on to commit crimes. Surprise, surprise. There are many, many things to say about systems like this and the way that they're being used in our society today. I'll restrict myself to saying that when you feed data collected from a society that's full of kind of imperfections, historical injustices, biases, when you feed that kind of data into a computational system, it's pretty likely that you're going to get an outcome that replicates these historical injustices, these biases, these problems. And in fact, what you often see with computational systems is that it not only replicates these problematic dynamics in our society, but it exacerbates and multiplies them. And there's very little check currently on how and when systems like this are being deployed. So we might think we have it bad in our country. Things seem kind of grim right now in all sorts of ways. But man, we are like coasting, we are golden compared to the situations in less stable countries and the role that these kind of destabilizing technologies are playing in those societies. So there's a civil war going on right now in Libya, and Facebook, it's popular, widely used everywhere. Facebook basically plays the same role in Libyan society that it plays in our society. People use it for similar purposes. It also there, as in many places, tends to exacerbate conflicts, tends to make people more angry and afraid. So in the US, you can go on Facebook and you can or Facebook or Twitter, and you can kind of be like, my neighbor's crazy, he's such a jerk, blah, 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 right? In Libya, you can go on Facebook or Twitter and you can say, my neighbor's crazy, he's such a jerk. Here's how you kill him. I just want to read a little bit of a blurb from this New York Times article from last month. So some keyboard warriors, as Facebook partisans are known in Libya, posted fake news or hateful comments. Others offered battlefield guidance. On one discussion page on Thursday, a user posted maps and coordinates to help target her side's bombs to a rival airbase. So I just want to make the point that this was like publicly posted information that on any given day, like a New York Times reporter could browse over to like Facebook, Libya Facebook, and see these like directions about how people could be killed. Tells you a little bit about the unintended consequences of building these algorithmic systems with very little provision for human oversight, right? It's kind of the situations that Facebook finds itself in these days. Okay, so I've gotten really dark and sad. I think there are all sorts of problems that we're dealing with right now. And I want to put forward the hypothesis to you guys that some of the reasons that we're grappling with these problems can be linked back to this trend that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, namely the emphasis on STEM, the kind of prioritization of STEM, particularly in the context of education, that is linked, I think, to a social notion that STEM, that algorithms, that math, that statistics can maybe solve all our problems. If we can somehow like distill things down into data, we can move away from like the messy human world, and we can elevate ourselves to this plane of like pure facts, like pure data, and we can function really logically, and we'll solve all our problems by doing that, right? It's been, I think, some of the ideology underlying this elevation of STEM, this prioritization of STEM. And I want to just say, I think that ideology and our trend to think in that way is profoundly misguided, mistaken, and dangerous. So I wanted to stop and like read this article a little bit because it's representative of some of the ways in which we talk about STEM, particularly in the context of education these days. So it says, when the Kentucky governor, Matt Bevin, suggested last month that students majoring in French literature should not receive state funding for their college education, he joined a growing number of elected officials who want to nudge students away from the humanities and towards more job-friendly subjects like electrical engineering. I would like to say that all of these problems that we seem to all of the sudden be grappling with right now are problems that I think the person who majored in French literature would actually be much better positioned to grapple with and try to solve. So the biggest problems that are facing our society these days are not problems that are solved by like a better algorithm or more data or like better math. They are ethical problems, they are moral problems, they are legal problems, they are political problems. They require kind of deep engagement with topics like history and philosophy and the law, kind of traditions drawn from the humanities. We abandon the humanities at our extreme peril. I hope we are at a point where we're starting to understand that and grapple with it and move away from a culture that elevates STEM and thinks that we can just kind of leave the humanities and all of those intellectual traditions by the wayside. So the first chunk of my talk, I wanted to call out to you how STEM is really deeply embedded in and practiced in every culture. In this kind of second phase of my talk, what I hope you take away is that STEM is not divorceable from culture. We cannot kind of separate STEM from the messiness of our lived like human lives. We cannot separate it from politics. We cannot separate it from culture. We cannot separate it from our complex kind of social human interactions. And to think that we can, again, is tremendously mistaken and tremendously dangerous. Okay, so I've showed you maybe a lot of worrisome stuff. I now wanted to shift into to thinking about ways that we could change things. So particularly in the context of education, what can we do to shift these dynamics? What can we do to tie STEM back to culture, to rebuild those relationships? So there's a wonderful intellectual tradition in education called culturally relevant pedagogy or culturally responsive pedagogy. And the basic idea behind this tradition is that educators should be responsive to the cultural background of their students. They should strive to kind of connect to their students' personal and kind of cultural and ethnic histories and identities, and that doing so is a tremendously effective way to engage kids in education. And it's a tremendously effective way, in particular, to engage kids who might otherwise be left behind, who are not members of the dominant culture and don't have that cultural engagement just kind of built into the system, right? So I wanted to share with you just the results of one study that is a recent study that's kind of a nice example of the way in which this approach can be extremely effective at engaging students and extremely effective at kind of changing the dynamics of our schools. So this was a recent study conducted by a group of researchers from Stanford. And what they did is they took a large cohort of students in the San Francisco Public School District. It was a little over 1,500 kids, kind of graduating from middle school and going into high school. And they took kids that were right on the cusp of like failing out of school. So kids who are like C, kind of D averages. And they took kind of half of those kids and assigned them to participate in an ethnic studies class for their first year of high school. And then they took the other half and just had them continue with their traditional kind of high school curriculum. I should say that this class was instantiated across a lot of different neighborhoods around San Francisco, and that for each particular school, for each particular neighborhood, it was a really different class. And so what the class consisted of was kind of an overview of the history of that community, the history of that culture, the history of that ethnicity, and then it encouraged the students to go back home, investigate their own personal history, their own community history, and then to bring that investigation, that engagement, kind of back to school. So that was what that class looked like. The outcome of this intervention was pretty spectacular. So they found that the kids who were randomly assigned to participate in these ethnic studies classes did way, way, way better in school than the other kids. The biggest reason that they did so much better is pretty simple, I think. Mainly these students started coming to school. So one of the ways in which disengaged kids, like disengage from school, is just the most obvious and simple way of all. They just stop coming. And this class, for whatever reason, was provided an incentive for them to just show up every day at school and engage. I think largely because they were showing up, their GPA went up like crazy, went up nearly 1.5 points on average, and they also finished a bunch more of their other classes, so the credits they earned went way up also. They were able to successfully complete many more other courses kind of in their school study. All because they had this one kind of simple opportunity to connect who they were, kind of who they were personally and culturally, to who they were expected to be at school, right? Making those connections is so powerful for young people. Should so be a huge part of what we do, what we focus on as educators. So this was an intervention that was, in a sense, kind of a specific, kind of broad engagement with students' culture. What I talked about at the beginning was kind of engaging kind of culture and STEM simultaneously. And I want to say that there are also all sorts of wonderful ways to do that. So if you are an educator, or if you're a parent, or if you're just interested in this topic, I want to point you to all sorts of wonderful resources that can help you kind of make connections between kind of STEM topics and cultural practices from all over the world. So this is just one kind of lovely example, kind of this book on ethnomathematics from Marcia Asher. I think you can approach this as a scholar and go out and start to read the literature from some of these fields. But I think also you get a tremendously long way from just paying attention to like what's happening out in the world and starting to make connections between the broad and diverse array of cultural practices out there and what kids are learning in school, what they're being asked to do in school, in particular, kind of STEM topics. So I wanted to give you just a more concrete example of, I think, how this can look in practice. So I talked about this study earlier, how kind of parents and others are much more likely to get like STEM toys for boys than for girls, right? It means they're much more likely to get stuff like this beautiful kind of geometric construction kit for boys than for girls. So one way to rectify this pattern is to like start to get girls, like to start to buy them toys like that, right? Like that's great, we should all do that. But the other way to rectify this problem is to realize that, oh, hey, like this toy that my guess is being kind of given predominantly to young women is just as much a STEM toy as that one on the left. And yet, these kinds of things were not included in that original toy study. We don't think of these as STEM toys. And yet it would tremendously behoove us to start kind of acknowledging the rich kind of STEM knowledge, expertise, kind of content that's embedded in these traditionally kind of female gendered activities. That's just an entirely different and perhaps more effective way of addressing that same problem. Just start to see and acknowledge these things. So I wanted to conclude with maybe a more specific example of how you can kind of marry kind of culture and STEM in the context of education. That's more kind of personal and kind of lets me share with you some of the creative work that I do. So I've been working for most of my career finding ways to connect computing, engineering, with art and craft and design, and then using that in the context of education to engage like lots of different people in engineering, in STEM, and also in art and design. So I wanted to share with you just one way that I think is beautiful and interesting that we can all do that. So before I start talking about specifically like the work that I do, I just wanted to set a backdrop for you, which is that in much the same way that computation and algorithms are impacting the way we communicate, kind of the way we conduct financial and social business of all sorts, that computation and algorithms are having similar impacts on the worlds of art and design. So this is perhaps most obvious in the realm of architecture. So if you do any traveling and if you've been to any big city recently, you'll notice that buildings are starting to go up that look and feel like no other buildings in the past, because these buildings were designed with the aid of computation. So here's just one example that I picked out among many, but it's an especially lovely one. I think this is a new building that recently went up in Chicago by Janine Gang. So a computationally designed structure with this beautiful kind of undulating facade. Similar kind of revolutions are happening kind of in all spheres of art and design. I'm especially fascinated by and interested in what's been happening in the universe of fashion. One of my favorite designers is a woman named Iris van Herpen. Here you see a piece from her spring 2018 collection. Again, a computationally designed, and then I think both 3D printed and laser cut construction there. So all sorts of beautiful, interesting stuff at the intersection of art and design and computation is happening out in the professional world. What might that look like if we kind of bring it back into the educational context? So I've been playing around in that space for quite a while. And the first way that I approach kind of exploring a domain like this is just to start to build stuff and to see like what's possible. What can I make that combines art and craft and design and computation? So these are all examples of kind of objects that I've built. A handbag with a kind of computationally generated design, kind of shirts, earrings, ceramics, and so on. You can do just all sorts of lovely stuff. One thing that I think is really interesting about these kinds of objects and about art and design objects in general is the natural role that they can play in our day-to-day lives. So when you make art projects, when you make design projects, you go back, you take them home, you hang them up in your house, right? My walls are papered with like the drawings that my son has done at preschool. Our house is also full of my kind of wacky computational design experiments. So this is a curtain in our house. I've been increasingly obsessed with kind of ceramics and using different computational techniques to build ceramics. Here's my son kind of drinking out of one of our cups. These are examples from other designers around the world. The point that I want to make by sharing these examples is, again, just the rich role that these artifacts can play in your day-to-day life. And I want to suggest that these kinds of artifacts can make really rich and interesting connections to young people's personal and cultural identities, that there are wonderful opportunities here that I think can be leveraged to, again, kind of connect young people's sense of themselves to what they're learning and doing in an academic kind of school context. So there are a range of wonderful educators out there that are currently doing these kinds of things with students, and I wanted to share a little bit of their work with you. So these are some projects that are done by this awesome math teacher who teaches in upstate New York. So he teaches math and computer science, and periodically he gives students assignments that are just like, make something beautiful with mathematics, make something beautiful by writing a computer program. And then he realizes these projects in a variety of ways. So there's a 3D printed cup on the left, and then the drawing on the right was drawn by a plotter machine, so a machine that you put a pen in, and then it draws out designs for you. So he's doing really wonderful work. You can follow some of it on his blog. He has this great blog. Another educator who's doing really gorgeous work with middle school and high school students is Erin Riley. She's a teacher in Connecticut. She teaches a course called Art and Code. This is an example of one of the projects that her middle school students did. So they wrote computer programs to generate these geometrical patterns that were then silk-screened onto clay and then fired using traditional clay processes. Then they could, of course, take these objects home and fold them into their day-to-day lives or give them away as gifts, do all sorts of those kinds of things with them. Ron Eglash is a really interesting researcher and scholar in this space. Perhaps some of you are familiar with his work. He has, over the course of, I think, at least 10 years, been developing a suite of what he calls culturally situated design tools. And this is a collection of tools that highlight different cultural practices and then kind of explicitly call out the STEM content in those practices, and then he develops these design environments where you can experiment with the mathematics, especially the mathematics and the computation behind some of these practices, and also learn about the history of the cultural practices themselves. So this is an example of one of his modules exploring kind of the geometry of traditional hair braiding, African American hair braiding techniques. So really, really lovely work. There's a whole suite of these tools, including ones for Native American beading, graffiti, all sorts of really interesting work there. This is another, just one of my favorite artists and educators right now is a young woman named Natrice Gaskins. She is working on a series of both her own personal artwork and also kind of educational work that she terms Afrofuturism. She is a computer scientist and an artist. This is a series of portraits that she's been working on of prominent African American figures. The way that these are generated is she has developed a system where she feeds into an artificial kind of intelligence program a photograph of a prominent African American along with some of her own kind of sketches of what she would like the ultimate portrait to look like. She kind of hands these over to the AI. The AI spits out an image that's like an amalgam of these two things. She then kind of gives it some feedback. They have this dialogue, and at the end of the dialogue, the result is a portrait like the one you see on the left. So this algorithmically and also kind of human generated portrait. What you see here on the right is she's then taking some of these images and turning them into kind of artwork that you can hold. This is a woodblock print that was generated from the image on the left. So she's both like just an amazing kind of groundbreaking artist, but also a fantastic educator. So the other part of what she does is she develops curricula and tools kind of to take some of these approaches into the classroom or into after-school programs. So an example of something that she's been working on just in the last 6 months or so is a set of activities that revolve around the Black Panther movie and kind of teaching kids about how they can kind of recreate some of the design motifs that were present in Black Panther, kind of using algorithms and then different fabrication machines like laser cutters and 3D printers. And she has kids kind of design and make their own kind of computationally generated jewelry and clothing. So really beautiful, creative work, kind of connecting art, design, kind of computation and culture, and in incredibly thoughtful and interesting ways. So the main takeaway, the main, I guess, thoughts that I'd like to impart to you tonight is just that STEM is deeply, deeply connected to and enmeshed in culture. And we should do more to acknowledge that, to see that, and to celebrate and embrace those connections in all their different kind of varieties and forms. I think we will have a better society, a more inclusive society, and a more honest and functioning society if we're able to do that. So thank you very much.